if he left his car key on the table, some of the Americans would drive out in a... Well, Richard, I'm afraid to hit it because I'm scared to death if I touch anything, I'll lose the screen. So maybe the rest of it will pop up here in a second. Whatever Richard said there, I'll share it with you online tomorrow if we don't get it all tonight. The next morning, we were instructed to get ready to evacuate. So they're leaving the camp. These 4,000 to 5,000 American men are leaving the camp. The whole day was a madhouse with bonfires raging and trading with the Russians and other POWs from other countries. So it almost kind of sounds like all bets are off. I think if they traded with the Russians, it probably... Oh, a 42 Ford, okay, is what he's saying. They would, if you give him the car keys, they drive off in his 42 Ford, is that what he said? So it was rumored that the Russian army was only 30 miles away. So the Russian army would be 30 miles to the east and coming in, and the German guards and the German commandant and people there, German soldiers, didn't want to be around when the Russians got there. At night, we could still see guns flashing in the east. Because of my wounded ankles, I was concerned I could not keep up with the group. Not knowing what to take, I packed all the food that I had saved. Now remember I told you earlier, they punctured the cans and they wouldn't let him save food. So I don't know what he had, but he must have had a few canned items and maybe some raisins, prunes, crackers, some other things there. And soap, which turned out to be a great trading item. So he even took a few bars of soap. We moved out the morning of April 8th, 1945, a barrack at a time, and I think 135 to 150 guys in a barrack, moving about a half hour apart. 6 to 8 guards went with each group, and we moved in groups of roughly 500, roughly 8 groups in all. So 8 5s, 4,000 men marching down the road. That's a lot of guys, isn't it? The first night, we rested along the Danube. During roll call the next morning, there were 30 men missing. I talked to other GIs and decided to stay with the group since we knew the war was almost over. We later heard that the Russians had bombed Stalag XVIIb. Thanks, Mary, for joining us. The Russians had bombed the prison camp. Dad says that we marched approximately 20 to 30 kilometers a day with only one rest stop. So I think 20 miles is or 20 kilometers, about 15 miles, I think. So about, 15 to 22, 23 miles a day with only one rest stop. Everyone had blisters on their feet because our shoes were not fitted very well. In the towns we walked through, we saw very few people, no cars, and only a few trucks. The people we did see would smile at us, but we could tell they were having a hard time. We did see a few wagons pulled by horses, cows, or oxen. The nights were cold. As a matter of fact, one place I read, it was the coldest spring in Austria in 20 years. Some nights we practically froze, but we continued to move despite our frozen hands and feet. We passed through many small towns, figuring the Germans were trying to avoid the cities. We did pass through the city of Linz, a small war industry city, and there were many bomb craters. I want to pause there, and I want to go to a section here, and this is off the Stalag XVIIb website in a section called the Forced March off of that website. And I'll find the author of it here in a minute. But I'm going to skim this just to give you a little more detail, a little more information. It said the evacuation route generally went west along the north side of the Danube River, crossed to the south side at Linz. So they've just got to Linz. So now they're going to cross from the north side of the Danube to the south side of the Danube. And it ended, as what I said, Wheelhart Forest, west of Braunau. Now I'm going to tell you the interesting fact about Braunau that will blow your mind. It's a total, I believe, coincidence that that's where the decision was made to stop by the German army. But the irony of that is Adolf Hitler was born in Branau, Austria. Okay, so that's just a bizarre coincidence, but it's true. I'm going to give you a little bit of a recap from this fella, and he says the 300-mile march took 18 days to complete. The malnourished and exhausted POWs were forced to walk up to 25 miles a day. The weather along the route was generally cold, wet, and miserable. It was one of the worst winters in the region in decades, as I mentioned. POWs often had to sleep outside without cover. The malnourished, tired prisoners had little to eat along the way. Some risked their lives at night to sneak away and look for food. Prisoners caught trying to escape, or those who could not keep up with their groups, were sometimes shot by the guards and left where they fell. And keep in mind that Dad's ankles weren't in good shape. And I'm skimming this. Most of the American prisoners stayed at the Wilhart Forest until May 12, 1945, when they were transported back to France. Now that's kind of putting the end before the beginning, but I wanted to read the stuff as it came up. Here's a little bit of his diary, and it's not really important what the days were, but they're in chronological order, and he's just talking about what happened on each day, and I think it obviously would be a very similar experience to what Dad had. Dad just didn't have this many details down, but this guy kept a journal at the time. He didn't have to remember it 50 years later. He said, I had a piece of bread and coffee for supper. We're sleeping under the stars. It's colder than hell. Next day, we walked all day, 23 kilometers. The German guards were telling him this. The bread is dark in color and has sawdust in it. Dad says this was common in camp. They used this to stretch the bread out by dumping sawdust in it. So if you were eating bread in a German prison camp or along this route, chances are it was stretched out to get more product out of it with sawdust. And then about 4 days later, it said the bread slices are getting thinner, 20 men to one loaf of bread. This one says 23 to 30 kilometers today. Tonight, some of us will get to sleep in a large barn. This is the first dry-covered sleeping place we've had. I want to share a photo with you. When Tracy and Rich and I were there, here's one of the barns, and we were actually able to stop at this barn and meet, I believe it was the daughter of the man and woman that had their barn and their property taken over that night by the Nazi guards and by the POWs, and many of the POWs that could squeeze in slept in this barn that night. Tracy says, I remember your dad talking with us when we were on the bus on the way to the forest. He remembered a lot. Yeah, he remembered a lot. So, but there's one of the barns that we were actually able to visit on our trip 5 years ago that the men stayed in one night. So you're kind of envision, was my father in that barn, or was one of the unlucky ones that had to sit outside? Next day, they told us we walked 27 to 30 kilometers a day, had thin potato soup for supper. A few days later, we're marching on the road to Linz, which is where I mentioned about the halfway point. We're sleeping in bomb craters and under the stars. The Russian Air Force is bombing a distant part of Linz because it was an industrial city. And then today we walked 26 to 32 kilometers. Tuesday, April 17th, started marching at 7:35 a.m. And I'm going to show you, this is, well, this whole thing is serious, but this gets even more serious. Hi, Kennedy. Welcome aboard. We walked through the town of Mauthausen. There's a large concentration camp nearby. Jerry guards were shooting men in our group that could not go on. As we walked by the concentration camp, and Tracy and Rich will remember this part, men were working in a rock quarry. We saw guards and prisoners. Now this is the Jewish prisoners in the concentration camp. We saw guards and prisoners whipping other prisoners with heavy leather belts. An air raid alarm blew 5 times during the middle of the night. And the next day they say, Russian POWs passed us. What a tragic sight. In other words, they were coming the other way. They are like walking skeletons. I want to pause there, and I want to show you some pictures, hi Nicole and Warren, of the Mauthausen concentration camp that was on our bus ride as we traced the tracks of our fathers. And here is the Mauthausen concentration camp. You could say in a way architecturally very beautiful, isn't it? But extremely, extremely brutal place in the 40s. This was a commemorative fence put up as to where the original fence might have been, but that was more of a piece of artwork overlooking the beautiful Austrian countryside. The quarry, they worked the Jews in the quarry to build these walls. Every stone in this wall was quarried, cut out, and carried up a set of steep steps and then hauled up here to build their own, what do you want to say? Build your own prison. And of course, tens of thousands of Jews died in this prison camp by abuse, by neglect, by starvation, and something else that I'll show you in a minute that's almost too horrific to think about. But like I say, this is the tough part. That's part of the gas chamber, and that's still there. You know, it's a working museum today, and that's where the gas was channeled through. And we actually walked through there. You can see the gas heads on top. That's a gas chamber where the Jews were gassed. And here's a sign separate from that, and the bodies were then burnt in the crematorium. I wanted to look this up, but I ran out of time. But I wanted to show you two pictures here. The top picture is the Day of Liberation by American forces. So if you can see the Jews at Mauthausen in their striped pajamas celebrating, and you can see some American tanks there, and then there's the view as it is today, or as it was in 2015. Those very same gates that we were standing at and taking photos back in 1945 showed the liberation of that concentration camp by American troops up above that. And I took that off of one of the walls because I thought it was so awesome that it matched the scene that we saw outside. So that, I didn't get the date on that, but I'm sure that was just a few weeks or just a couple of months after Dad and the men in the forced march from Stalag 17 passed by. Okay? Now we're down on this one, and then I'll pick up with Dad's in a minute. We're down to Sunday, April 22nd. And let's see. They're not quite there yet. Red Cross food parcels arrived today. Okay, I guess they are there now. I'm sorry. Red Cross parcels arrived today. What a godsend for us. We are all very hungry. We had bread and coffee for breakfast. I traded one cigarette for a little bit of salt. He says, I got a parcel of French biscuits. They look like dog food biscuits. Very hard, but quite tasty. And then the next night, they slept in another barn. A couple nights later, now finally, they get to Branau at 2:30 p.m., and we are told after 18 days and 300 miles in freezing conditions, we are told this is our destination. Our guards have moved us into a wooded area, and we're supposed to make our own shelter. Now I'm going to pick up, I won't be in the exact same spot, but now I'm going to pick up where I left off in Dad's book. We're back to Dad's book. One day, some P-38s flew overhead, meaning American fighter jets, or not jets, airplanes. But no German fighters went after them, and no flak was shot at them. After a total of about, he says, 200 miles walking, but it was actually closer to 300, we stopped in a wooded area to stay. meaning Branau, near Branau, the Wilhart Forest, as I mentioned. By this time, our German captors had fled. We could hear tanks and trucks on the other side, meaning the other side of the river Inns, I-N-N-S. But no traffic was on the road on the side of the river we were on. Either the Germans or the Americans had blown up all the bridges on the river, making it obviously hard to cross. Life on the forced march was difficult, but we knew the war was coming to an end soon. Along the way, I traded a bar of soap to a farmer for a small basket of carrots. So now is when his bar of soap comes in handy. He trades one bar of soap and gets a basket of carrots. And I think one time he and I were talking about that, and he said, I don't know if it was a fair trade or the farmer was just afraid of me. I wasn't going to do anything. I just wanted some food. So I handed him a bar of soap and, pointed to my mouth, and he came out with this big basket full of carrots. I was tickled to death. So he says, I took him back that night, and several of the men in our group, there were 12 of us that were kind of sticking together and helping each other find food and things. And he said, we cooked those carrots with a can of corned beef that somebody had hauled with them, and it made a nice meal for about 10 to 12 men. Here's a couple pictures. In Branau, you can see some men cooking, and I think that bottom picture is probably the aluminum plant, which we haven't got to that part yet, but we'll get to that in a minute. Okay, finally, on April 25th, 1945, a small convoy of American troops came by with a general. He wanted to know who we were because he had no records to show any American POWs in this area, plus any other country's POW. He ordered a colonel to go to work and get us out of there. Now, my dad wrote that way, but that's not the way he said it. The way he said it was, the American general pulls into camp with a small convoy, and he looks out and he looks at all these guys in the forest, and I'll show you some photos of little lean-tos and cabins and things. They had made a temporary home because they didn't know how long they were going to be there. And he said, who the hell are you guys? I have no idea who you guys are. You're not supposed to be here. Who are you? And of course then you get your, not senior officers because you had no officers, but the senior men in the company that were the ones that were to represent the rest of them. And they explained to the general who they are, and that's when he ordered a colonel to go to work and get them out of there, and that's when they made their way to the so-called aluminum plant. I'm going to show you a few pictures, and gosh, there's just bunches and bunches of them. But I'll show you a few pictures. This is out of the Craigie Memories book, and all these photos are when they're in the forest. They're in the forest near Branau, Austria, and they're making camp. They're trying to find a way to have shelter, and I wanted to see if I could find a picture of some of the... Here's a crude lean-to up here, kind of like what we might have made in the Boy Scouts in a survival camp out or something like that. Here's some stacks of logs that men cut down with axes attempting to build log cabins. So they were building lean-tos, they were building log cabins, they were building anything they could because they didn't know how long it was going to take them or how long they were going to be there. But one thing that I did read was, of course, they had no tools. They had no tools to take with them. But somehow along the way, they must have bartered or traded perhaps with farmers again, maybe a pack of cigarettes for an axe, but they ended up with 6 or 7 axes. Now think about that, 6 or 7 axes for 4,000 guys. So he said every time he'd say, hey, are you done with that axe? Well, that axe belongs to so-and-so, and he's already got a list of like 10 guys on it that want it before you can get it. So they had very little to work with, so they had to do what they could, and it's kind of hard to fell trees without a saw or an axe. Let's see. Let me see where I picked up. Okay, we talked about the colonel to go to work and get them out of there. On April 27th, 1945, so just 2 days after the American general had come through, we received trucks with food, but we still had to divide them up to share, and this wasn't made clear to me till this moment when I was reading Dad's book. They had to share with the French, the English, the Serbs, and the Poles. So they've moved this whole segment of the camp out behind the Americans. So in addition to the 4,000 Americans, I have no idea how many French, English, Serbs, and Poles there were. But they had to divide the parcels up with them as well. The colonel told us we would stay where we were along the river ends. The river was down a very steep hill from us, and there was a spring about 3/4 of the way down to the river where we could get water to drink and cook with. We didn't have very good pails to carry the water in, so during the climb back up the hill, we lost half of the water that we had gathered. And they said it usually took 3 to 4 hours to go down, get the water, and climb back. As I mentioned just a second ago, we constructed shelters like lean-tos, figuring we would be there for a few days. We built some log cabins, or some guys built log cabins figuring they'd been there longer. We built a latrine by digging a hole and placing logs on top to sit on. He says we were on the wrong side of the river ends. In other words, all the activity from the American troops was on the opposite side. It was a dividing point. The Americans were on the west and the Russians were on the east. We knew more Allied troops would be coming because the Army knew we were there. By May 1st, we began to anticipate trucks coming to get us every day, but we settled in and waited. We knew the war was over, but the Army still had some pockets of resistance. One day, a jeep with a colonel came into the camp. He asked all the men that were able to walk to go with him to a small warehouse. That's the abandoned aluminum plant I was telling you about 20 miles away, where we could set up a mess hall and have a shelter. There would be a few trucks for the sick and those that could not walk. The next morning, we were on our way. We made it there by late evening. We got hot food there, and some GIs asked us to assist in distributing blankets and clean clothes. We also had running water to wash up. Can you even imagine what that would have been like? Food, shelter, new clothes. I mean, when's the last time they changed their clothes? 2 years ago? Other than being able to perhaps wash them as they went along. We camped at the warehouse for a few days with the Army helping more each day as supplies caught up. We were told that trucks would be sent and we would then go to an airport to be flown to France. We made a short trip to the river where a bridge had been built to get to the airport, then a flight to France, and then on to Camp Lucky Strike, which had been the first stop for the D-Day invasion troops. I found information on Camp Lucky Strike, and it was called one of the cigarette camps. So I don't know what all cigarette names they had back then. Certainly they had Lucky Strikes and Chesterfields. And so here's a couple photos of what Camp Lucky Strike looked like during the war. And so things were staged there after the invasion of Normandy for the troops going in, and now things are staged there for the men leaving and going back home. Let's see. It would be our home for the next few days. So Camp Lucky Strike, where we just saw all the tents set up. We could not go to a BX. In other words, they couldn't go to the store. They did pay us $20, and you think about $20 in 1945 in the middle of nowhere. So we had some money, but it wasn't French money, so they couldn't go out and, I don't know if there were any French bars nearby, but they couldn't go out and spend it in France. They could only spend it at the BX, and it sounds like they couldn't go to the BX, so I don't know. It wasn't French money. We were trucked to Le Havre and put on a Liberty ship. I want to read you something from the newspaper. It says, Mrs. J.B. Clance received a V-mail letter this morning that her brother, Tech Sergeant Louis Baker, stating that he had been released from Stalag XVIIb Prison Camp in Germany. He evidently thought his parents had been notified of his release, according to the letter, which read that other than the loss of a great amount of weight, and I'm guessing anywhere from 30 to 50 pounds, he expected to be home soon. He was a gunner on a flying fortress. So that was a newspaper article that was printed in the local newspaper at that time. Back to the book. We're almost to the end. 6 days later, we landed in Boston, Massachusetts, one of the first groups to return. There were only a few people there as we landed, but the war in the Pacific was still going on. I found this poster in the internet wonderful, and again, I know it's backwards, but it says, "Welcome to the States, Boston Port of Embarkation, Camp Miles Standish." So he said, we loaded on trucks, so this is after, I don't know if it's 5-6 days on a Liberty ship back to the USA. We loaded on trucks to go to Camp Miles Standish in Boston. As a tech sergeant, he said, I was actually the highest ranking enlisted man on our truck. So the guy said, you sit up front if you're the highest ranking. And he says, when we reached the camp, the truck driver said, where do you want to go? And he says, I don't know. Where are we allowed to go? And he said, well, if you got money, I'm told I can take you to the BX. He said, take us to the BX. So he said, we all had our $20 because they wouldn't let us spend anything on the Liberty ship. So he said, since they wouldn't sell us candy on board the Liberty ship, guess what everybody bought? And he says everybody bought candy. How about this, guys? It was about 4 cents a bar. So we all bought boxes of 24, right? For 96 cents. 96 cents for 24 candy bars, Mars bars, Snickers bars. I don't know what all they had back then. We'd have to Google that, but they had candy bars. Most of the trucks had gone directly to the theater for a briefing, but we were not late to the briefing since we had been issued uniforms and supplies in France. Speaking of uniforms and supplies in France, I want to show you something. And I apologize if I've repeated myself doing this 5 nights. I don't think I did. But this is my dad's, I guess you'd call it, dress cap or dress hat. And that's one of an enlisted man. I think it would be a different insignia with a bigger backing on it if it were an officer. And it's in pretty good shape, as you can see. And so I believe this cap was more than likely issued to him probably at Camp Lucky Strike when they got a change of clothes before they boarded the Liberty ship to go back to Boston. So this is obviously a treasured piece of family history that will get handed down, I guess, to one of my grandsons or one of them here. That's what I've got, 4 grandsons. So someday. So back to the candy. The next day, we went to a meeting where they asked for information about us, although not nearly as much as the Germans had, okay? I filled out papers like I did when I was in the service, saying what group I was in, when I was shot down, the camp I was in, and my rank. They asked if we were wounded, but didn't ask for much detail. They did not send us to the doctor unless someone asked to go. They noted that I had a broken foot, but there was no examination. Next, I went to the payroll clerk. I knew I had a lot of money due me. He offered me $50. I asked for $500. Okay, so I love my dad. Do you remember that scene in It's a Wonderful Life when there's a run on the bank and the one guy wants, what's he want, $200, and Jimmy Stewart tries to give him $20, and I forget what he settles on, and he said, that'll close my account. No, your account's still open. This is just a loan. But the guy kept insisting for a larger amount. That sounds like my dad. I asked for $500. He could not give me that much. I went then down to a captain and asked for $500, and he would only give me $100. But he did make it from $20 to $50 to $100. So I thought that was pretty good that he just stayed after it till he got $100. He says, I didn't know that I would only need enough money to get home. He said, I just didn't know. But think $100 in those days was a lot of money. The next day, I was on a train to Camp Atterbury, Indiana. It was then that I began to realize I was free and able to do as I wanted. Even though I was told where to go and when to be there, I knew I was on my way home for a while. I left Camp Atterbury for home the last part of June 1945. It was a very happy reunion with my family, except for my mother. Her health had really gone downhill. I now realized how much she had suffered, not knowing all that time whether I was dead or alive. The Red Cross and the Army had portrayed the prison camps to be rather nice with plenty of food. She was devastated to realize this was not the truth. I had a 100-day leave through the summer of 1945. Wow, 100-day leave. The war in Japan was ending while I was still at home. I had no plans to stay in the service. I had a little money, so I began to plan and think about my future. At the end of my leave, I was sent to Texas. After 2 more months in the service, I believe it was San Antonio, I was officially discharged in October 1945 as a master sergeant with a 20% disability for my foot. I still did not have much of a physical and was giving no medical exam. So that's where I'm going to leave the book. I've got a couple more things to show you, and then we're going to wrap up. I have some photos that we took in the Branau Forest. There's Terry and I at a memorial in the forest for where the men from Stalag XVIIb camped. So, you know, we were all excited to stop and see the location. Obviously, 70 years later, you know, you're not going to see any remnants of what was there with the forest growth. But it was just really a special moment for us to see that was the end of the road for our dads, and that was the end of our bus trip that day that took us in one day, in a few hours, what had taken our fathers 70 years before 18 days to march. These are some of the beautiful views that we passed on our bus trip, and very similar things to what they would have seen because we went about the same time. Tracy, I think, set that up so we were there about the same time. Some of the beautiful scenery. And as we looked at some of these things, we thought, you know, these are old enough for our fathers to have seen as they passed through this area on their march. And so anytime you see something like that on a hillside, you know that was there in 1945. Probably that was there in 1845. But as we would see those buildings or those aqueducts or train tracks or whatever, or a building like this, we would realize we were walking on almost sacred ground to us because we realized our fathers had traveled that very same trip. Probably seen it from a completely different perspective and certainly not in the comfort of an air-conditioned bus. This is the River Inn. So this is the river that they were referring to when they talked about going down the hillside and getting a bucket to put their water in, and by the time they got back up to the top, they had little or no water left in their bucket or whatever container they might have to hold water in. And so that's a little bit of what we did on our Austrian trip, and I'll post those photos and maybe a few more that I knew I wouldn't have time to do. The last thing I want to show you, and again, I will post this as well, and I apologize in advance because we all know it's going to be in reverse. And I'll try to hold it up here so you can see it in reverse, and then I'll read it to you. And another great family heirloom that we've got, and it's a Western Union telegram, and it's the original telegram that my Aunt Lucille received from my dad when he arrived back in the United States, and I'll read it to you. It says, Camp Miles Standish, Massachusetts, June 12th. So June 12th, 1945. Mrs. J.B. Clance, 321 Miller Avenue, Denison, Ohio. Quote, "Back in good old USA, all well, can't wait to see you, furlough soon, love, Eddie." 2:35 p.m. One of my favorite documents that I've ever had the pleasure to see, and thank goodness that my Aunt Lucille and Uncle Joe kept every telegram, every scrap of paper, every letter from training, every letter from prison camp, and at some point in time gave those all back to my dad so that we would have them, for generations to come. I'm sure I've missed something. If you have questions, feel free to text me, or I'll post these on Facebook and you can ask me. I'll try to put them in the order of the nights that we did them, the photos or the documents that was relevant to the programs that we did, so you can follow up and look. Over the next week or so, I'll post all 5 of the videos to YouTube, so they'll be up on there if you missed one or missed part of one. And everything on the tape from 2 nights ago, everything on the recording is there. It's just cut in half. But I went back and watched it, and it picked right back up where we left off. So if you watch the whole thing, you won't miss anything. But that's the only one that's in 2 parts, because if you weren't watching the other night, my Wi-Fi cut out right at the end. I can't thank you all enough for allowing me to share this with you. And I just want to leave you with a couple thoughts. And the first thought that I want to leave you with is, I have a lot of friends on here, Carolyn, Rich, and Tracy in particular, whose dads were also prisoners of war in Stalag XVIIb. Well, it wasn't Rich's father, but it was a very close relative. And so we're kind of kin in that respect. And then Nancy Moore Cramlett is on here, and Nancy's dad and my dad were both prisoners of war at different locations in Germany. And Budlin was my scoutmaster growing up, and he was in the Bataan Death March and a prisoner of war for the Japanese. And all these other men and women that served, and I don't mean just in World War II, but in whatever war they may have served, this is just one story. It's not any more important, it's not any less important than any one man or woman's story about what happened to them in a time of war where they were, fighting for their country in a very difficult situation. It's just that my dad was interested enough in this over the years to document this, and because he gave us enough information, we could go research and find even more things out about the detail that he left behind. And the one thing that I can tell you that he left behind was a lot of the brutality. And so I shared a little bit of that with the passing by the concentration camp at Mauthausen, because he didn't even mention it. But yet it's mentioned in every other single journal entry or diary that I've read about the forced march. So I know he was there, but he's wiped that out, or he just felt it was too brutal to share. So part of the reason I felt like it was important to share those things with you is that was the reality of the situation. But I also want to thank everybody, because obviously our country and this world is undergoing something now none of us have ever seen. My dad was born in 1920, so he missed the Spanish flu by 2 years. So it's been over 100 years since we've encountered anything that has turned our world upside down the way this has. And I just want to say that I found a lot of metaphors and a lot of analogies in my father's story of wartime and being in prison and not being able to go anywhere and not being able to do anything and being in peril in several situations. And so I just think about us as civilians going through that right now. This is our time. And I know, especially as Americans, that we're all going to stand up and do what we've got to do. So love each and every one of you. Thank you for joining me and indulging me these 5 nights. It's been a joy to do this. And I will post this stuff to Facebook. And if you ever have any questions about any of the resources, or you want to read any of the books or watch any of the movies, just send me a text or a Facebook message or something, and I'll gladly share the information. Oh, also one last thing. Several of you ask about Dad's book, and I've got some copies that we made like this that aren't terribly expensive to make, and we've probably made a couple thousand of these over the years. So if you want one of those, just text me or private message me on Facebook or get a hold of me, and I'll throw a hard copy out to you in the mail. I mean, I could do it by electronic, but quite frankly, I just as well throw it in an envelope and send it to you. And there's no charge. It's my joy to be able to share that with you. And then if you miss parts of it, you can certainly read it. But yes, I elongated it and I added a lot of things to it, but it was all reality. It's all things that he just simply didn't think about when he was writing the book. So again, thanks, and stay safe out there. And if you're an essential worker, if you're a doctor, a nurse, working in a nursing home or an assisted living facility, God bless you all for everything you're doing. If you're an essential worker, like I am, as a grocer or in a pharmacy or some other business that can't shut down, God bless all of you. And if you're pretty much ordered to stay home and hunker down, do that, because we don't need all of us out there on the highways, and we don't need all of us out there every day. We'll get through this thing, and we appreciate you all being online for this. And God bless you all, and good night. Thank you.